Hello, welcome to the Heart of the Piano YouTube channel. I'm Bob Rose. Welcome to part 2 of the most common mistakes that I see made by non-professional pianists, amateur pianists. So just a very quick caveat. Obviously not every single non-professional pianist. Some of them are going to play really well, but this is like 99% of non-professional amateur pianists. So to get straight on with it, this is like the belief, and it's to do with technique. It's the belief that we play the piano with our fingers. And yes, the finger is the part that touches the keys, but this can be a really, really bad problem. And it's going to be incredibly difficult to really go into this in huge depth in one YouTube video. So bear in mind, this is only going to be quite a superficial dive into what is basically sort of really deep piano technique. Now, what I mean by this in its most superficial way that I see over and over again, even in my diploma level students, and I just see this everywhere, non-professional pianists, when people play, I see the two digits nearest the fingertip. They're actually called the distal and the proximal phalange, but I'm just going to call them distal because to my mind it's just kind of an easy way of talking about them. The distal joints, the joints most distant from the core of our body, the ones nearest the fingertips. So when people play, it's like, I'm thinking of ET Phone Home, for people who are old enough, but it's like people play and they pull with their fingertips in this way as they play the key. So let's imagine that I'm playing some notes, and hopefully you can see my finger fairly clearly, and it'll be something that looks like this. But there's this sense that the finger is pulling and hooking at the key. And there's not really much else going on in the metacarpal joint. The metacarpal, I'm going to be talking about metacarpal a lot. The metacarpal joints are where the finger meets the hand. So they're like what people think of as the big knuckles, the big knuckles here. Where the finger meets the hand, they are the metacarpal joints. So they tend not to really get used a lot. It's mostly the distal joints, or the distal and the proximal phalange. Hope I'm pronouncing phalange right. Please do let me know, doctors, if I'm pronouncing it wrong. I'm sure you will. So there's not much movement then going on in the metacarpal joints, not much going on in the wrist at all, maybe a little bit of up and down, not much going on in the arm, and so on and so on. So I see this a lot, and particularly in beginners. So beginners will be like, and get this feeling that everything happens with the pulling of the fingertips. So this is really a very, very deep topic, because I think that one of the major reasons why this happens, and I talked about this a little bit in part 1 of my series on the common mistakes that non-professionals make. And again, I'm going to direct you to my podcast as well, where I talk about the psychology of how we learn and how we perform, how we play the piano. There's so much psychological stuff that I don't really talk about on my YouTube channel, and I will talk about it on my YouTube channel. So if you're interested in that stuff, click on the subscribe and on the bell icon to be notified. But basically, what I talk about a lot in my podcast, and there'll be a link above and in the description to my podcast, is that when we are under stress, when we feel that we're not good enough, when we're not learning in the most optimal way, we go into this narrow focus with the shoulders going forwards, the neck going forwards. We go into this narrow, tight focus with our eyes. It feels like effort. And it's really very, very unhelpful for learning music, which is not something that gets learnt in that kind of way. And this is really the most common problem why adults are slower learning instruments. It's why children just learn so effortlessly, and you get these incredible children virtuosos who seem to play completely effortlessly, because children really can't stare and hyperfixate on things, whereas adults can. So when we hyperfixate on the music, on the notes that we're supposed to be playing, we have to play a C, a D, an E, and we hyperfixate, and we are not embodied. We are not aware of the feelings of everything going on in our body. So our nervous system is in a state of fight, flight. The body doesn't feel safe. We don't even feel the body. We're in this state of panic, narrow focus on what we're supposed to be doing. We're very much in our heads. So what happens to the body and the mind is that really we're only aware of having fingertips. So in that state of mind of intense narrow focus, we know we've got fingertips, we know we've got these kind of distal joints, and nothing else in the body exists. And I would say this is one of the most common reasons why so many people are just playing with their fingers and their fingertips. So there are so many reasons why this is a bad idea. One reason, and I'm going to try not to spend too long on this. A lot of people talk about finger independence and prescribe things like Hannon exercises and Cherney exercises and all this kind of thing, because we want to be able to very quickly use different fingers and have independence, so that when we use one finger, the other finger isn't being pulled with it. Now, what happens because of the physiology, because of the way that the hand is with all the tendons, if we are pulling with our distal joints, and think about it, just put your hand out in front of you and only move the joints, the distal joints of, let's say, your fourth finger, and you'll find that your third and little finger will pull with it. It's almost impossible to make those distal joints move. Some people can do it in a very awkward way if they just, I can't do it, but they can do it in a really awkward way if they just move one of the joints, or they do it in a really weird way. But if you're playing the piano, that's not going to happen. Moving the distal joints will pull at all your other distal joints, because the tendons are kind of joined together in your hand, linking all the fingers. And a lot of this is genetics, and different people have their tendons linked in different ways. Now, if you think about moving your fingers purely from the metacarpal joint, the metacarpal joint is the big knuckle. Now, what we want, and again, I'm rushing through this, and really this could be an encyclopedia. This could be hours and hours and hours and weeks of courses, and I'm trying to distill it into something very, very quick. But, if you're interested, subscribe to the channel, because I'm probably going to go into this in a little bit more detail very gradually. But this is just like very quickly trying to go into a broad discussion of how I approach all this kind of stuff. Now, I think the classic way of teaching this, if you take your hand and put your hand on your kneecap. So if you're sitting down, don't know if you probably won't be able to see my knee, but you put your hand on your knee, and your foot is on the floor, and your hand is relaxed, and then you lift your hand. That's like a natural curve of the fingers. So when you're relaxed, your fingers are not just dead straight. That needs a certain amount of muscular effort to make your fingers just go straight. When they're relaxed, they have a natural curl to them. It's not like you are making them curled, because that's not relaxed, but a natural relaxation, like if you're asleep, they will just form this very natural curl. And one way to get that is put your hand on your knee, bring it up, and chances are that's going to be like a nice relaxed shape. Now, if we start from that position with your fingers in this natural curl, and then purely move those fingers just from that metacarpal joint without tension, and again, this could take ages to properly describe, but if we think of the fingers as like pistons moving up and down from the metacarpal joint, and what a lot of people do, if they think about moving each finger individually from the metacarpal joint, especially with the fourth finger and the little finger, when they move this metacarpal joint, they will still pull in with the finger as they move the metacarpal joint. And when I'm coaching my students, when I'm teaching, it takes quite a long time to show how to move this metacarpal joint without also trying to pull with the little finger, because I think people overfixate on it and think it's a difficult thing. And when it becomes this very difficult thing, that, and we're not feeling our fingers. We're not interoceptive. Interoceptive is I'll talk about this word a lot, but I'll try not to go down this rabbit hole. It's the opposite of being aware of everything outside of the body. It's the physical, felt sense of what is going on inside the body. And it's not thinking about the finger, it's directly feeling and experiencing all the subtle, nuanced physical sensations. Not thinking about it, but feeling it. So when we're feeling the finger, we're probably less likely to pull with the fingertips. If we're very much stuck in our heads and trying to move the finger, it's almost like the distal joints will just pull. What we want to avoid, it's like, marionette puppets. So marionette puppets are like where you have the wooden cross with strings and then the puppet is below. And I think a lot of people approach playing the piano with technique as if they are the controlling the marionette puppet and our body is the puppet. So there's like a detachment from what the body is feeling. We want to be the body. We're not our mind trying to shape and control the body, almost like our body is a puppet, but we are directly inside our body. We are embodied. This is very profound, and I'll talk about it another time because there's so much to say about all this kind of stuff. It's too much to go into in this video. So anyhow, if we're in our heads, there's this tendency to pull with these distal joints. If we think about it too much, there's a tendency to pull with the distal joints. Ideally, what we move from the metacarpal joint, and all the other joints are just completely relaxed and don't do anything. This is not straightforward for a lot of people. And again, this is like a good reason why sometimes we can't always teach ourselves. Sometimes it's useful to have a teacher, and the teacher can guide all these kinds of things, because no matter how well I describe it, it's much easier to guide somebody else and their movements and watch what they're doing and sort of be able to go, can you feel this thing? Anyhow, so when we move from these metacarpal joints, which is the big knuckle joints, we genuinely are much more able to move every single finger independent of all the other fingers. Whereas when we're using our distal joints, they're all connected to each other and they pull on all the other joints. So that's one reason to not be using the distal joints, because we have more finger independence when we're using the metacarpal joints. More reasons, the metacarpal joints are faster and more responsive. So if we want to play fast, generally the metacarpal joints move a lot quicker and they're a lot more agile than the distal joints. Now, I'm talking about 99% of the time, we don't really want to use the distal joints. There are times that there's like 1% of the time where we might want to. So there are techniques of playing where we do flick inwards with the distal joints. And that's in a lot of Baroque music and classical music, where we want to play very, very, very fast, very staccato. But I do not really recommend this at all until you're beyond grade 8. Occasionally, if I have good students, I'll teach it sort of grade 6, grade 7, grade 8. But only when I'm really happy that the student already has pretty good technique. Most of the time, the last thing you want to do is be pulling with those distal joints. So I would say that since I've been teaching a lot in the last, 7 years or something, what I try and do as a teacher is to try and reverse engineer, well, what do I do? What do I do with my technique? And what I've realized, and again, most of these things that I'm talking about, they're not really things that other teachers teach. And we all have our different ways of teaching. And there will probably be teachers who disagree with the way that I'm teaching this stuff. If you do disagree, please do leave comments below. I'm always up for open, healthy debate. But I find that this is very useful. My students find this is very useful. And I find that this works. Now, I realized that very subconsciously all my life, and people tell me I have good technique, and all my life, intuitively, subconsciously, for good technique, there's a principle that I've reverse engineered, which is the principle of levers and of going for the larger levers. So So a lever has a fulcrum, and the fulcrum is basically the part that kind of stays stationary, the part that the lever rotates from. So the key on the piano is a lever that has a fulcrum, and the fulcrum is sort of quite a bit into the piano. So if you think about, let's say this pencil here is a lever and it's attached here. So here's the lever, and the fulcrum is where my fingers are. The fulcrum's the bit that's moving the least. So if you think about it, the whole point of levers is that the longer the lever is, the less you need to move the edge of the lever to be able to control it in really subtle ways, or you have more power with it. So if I have a lever, let's say I go back to my lever, the pencil here, and I try and play in a very, very sensitive way in this part here, it's going to be way more difficult to control that than if I'm here. That surely makes sense, right? That's surely logical. Here is a lot more difficult to control than if I'm here. So, by the way, this is one reason why generally we want to play nearer the edge of the keys, like nearest to me. The nearer in we go towards the key, the less control we have. It's subtle, but it really does make a difference. Now, conversely, if I really wanted to play with power, and I wanted to try and press down the key with a lot of power, here we don't have a lot of power, but here we have loads of power. And if I want to play really quietly and I make very subtle motions here, we're going to have a lot more control than if I move it here. This is like the principle of levers. So another way of thinking about this is if I'm using my distal joints, and let's take the very final joint of my hand here as this example, and I'm trying to control a key using only this part of my finger, I'm never going to get as much control as if I don't move these joints and I treat this entire part of the finger as a lever and my metacarpal joint is the fulcrum. Obviously, intuitively and logically, moving, or even like this, moving from here, and this is good because these are the weaker fingers. And what people try and do with their weaker fingers, they wonder why it's so difficult to have control with the weaker fingers. But if we use the metacarpal joint, and I'll use my little finger so that you can see it clearly, this is obviously going to have much more control when I'm quiet, and much more control to be nice and loud than if I'm trying to pull with the smaller joints, because it's just a bigger lever. You're just obviously going to have more control. Now then, if we keep on extending that principle, a lot of the time I don't even want to use my metacarpal. We can look at the wrist, and I can treat from the wrist joint all the way to the little finger as one unit. And if I'm now moving like this, I can now play with even more control. I can go even quieter. I can have even more power if I want it. And if you get really good at having a nice, loose, relaxed wrist joint, you can still play really fast and all that kind of stuff. Obviously, you can't do this if you need to play scales. You can't just go... you can. There are times when you do that. But if you're just playing one note, if you just want to play one note, there's no reason with one note to use your distal joints or your metacarpal. You can use your wrist. But then if we go even further, then there's your entire forearm from the elbow joint. And if we treat this as one unit, and when I say treat it as one unit, I don't mean be stiff, I don't mean be tense. We can be relaxed. But if I now move the entire forearm, and I'm relaxed, but I'm not going to move the wrist and the fingers particularly. They stay reasonably stable. And if I move, so if I now play that same as before, and I'm now moving from the elbow joint, and I can do it in both hands. And I'm not tense in my wrists. This now gives me even more control and even more power and even more ability to control exactly how loud it's going to be. I can decide exactly how loud I want it, because we now have quite a large movement that we have control over. Whereas if I try and make that same type of sound from my distal joints, you can see logically and intuitively that's way more difficult to control, right? So another thing to bear in mind with this, we could use the wrist and the fingers and the elbow kind of all at the same time, but then you've got a little bit of a chaotic situation going on where you've got all these different joints all moving, and it becomes a little bit more difficult to predict what they're going to do. So bear in mind that I think it's quite a good solid technique that when we're using the larger levers when we can, that we're not using all the smaller ones. But when I land, I'm flexible, so I don't just land and go and just suddenly stick. I can use the whole lever from the elbow, and then still have like a shock absorber effect when I land. So the wrist, the fingers all move when I get there, but as I'm going down, they're just relaxed but not moving. Then everything moves when I get there. This gives so much control. Now, there are times when you might want to use your upper arm as well, but what I would argue is that when you're playing from your elbow joint, you already have gravity. So if I just drop, if I just let go of holding my forearm up and just let everything drop from the elbow joint, it's incredibly rare that you're going to want anything louder than that. You know, even if, let's say I hold my hand here and I'm just going to let go. It's loud. It's really loud. And actually my piano's turned down a little bit at the moment. But, you know, I could drop from like half an inch and it's pretty loud. So it's very rare that you would need to use anything in your upper arm. Really, all you need 99.9% of the time is just movements from the elbow, because you've got gravity to help you go down. And the more relaxed you are, and that's something else I want to say as well. What is good technique? Because I really live by this particular way of describing what good technique is. In my opinion, good technique is the laziest way to get the sound that you want. And I use this word lazy, which can be loaded, because almost every single one of my students is the opposite of lazy. They are tense, nervous, striving. Everything is too difficult. And for almost everybody, what they need to do is become lazier to get the sound that they want. And this is important because, you know, to a lot of people, lazy might be, yeah, whatever. But that won't get you the sound that you want. You want to get the sound that you want, which is usually being poised. You want a poised posture. And really, it's the most efficient, most relaxed way of getting the sound that you want. But if I describe good technique as the most efficient, most relaxed way of getting what you want, most people will tense up trying to figure out how to get it. That's why I use the word lazy, because to most people, it actually feels lazy because there's this belief everything has to feel difficult. And again, that's a whole other thing that I'm going to try not to go down that rabbit hole, because that's huge. We also have other levers, like as well as our wrists going up and down, our wrists can also rotate. So if I want to play with my thumb, I could do that with my wrist, just the up and down. I could do that. I could do that from the elbow joint, or I could actually rotate onto it. And that's a whole different lever as well to rotate. So the Taubman technique is all about rotation, but I taught rotation for years before I heard of Taubman, because a lot of the time it is the laziest, most efficient way of getting the sound that you want. So going along with all of this, now I picked all this up in my life completely intuitively, because I've always been pretty good in my whole life at being very much in my body when I'm at my instrument. Because I think that if you're learning a piece of music, if you're learning whatever on the piano, and you're really aware of how everything feels in your whole body, in your posture, in how your posture is affecting your state of mind, in and you're trying to play like my thing my whole life is like, well, how hard can it be? There are people out in the world who play this and make it look effortless. If it's difficult, it's because I'm moving in a way that's not helpful. I need to figure out how to move and how to feel until it becomes easy. And I think this is like a step that most amateur musicians miss out on. So it's not like I needed to be taught technique. It's more like I would explore, I would explore, I would explore every joint, everything that I moved until I went, aha, and found the effortless way of getting the sound that I want. And to do that, you've got to feel what's going on in your body. Now, most people don't do this. Most people will stare at their music, they'll stare at their fingertips, they won't feel their body. And if they can't play it straight away, they'll just try harder and harder and harder and harder and just do it over and over and over again and trying harder and harder and harder, but not going, well, what can I change? What can I change? And basically, whatever I'm learning, I would say it's pretty obvious to me that if it hasn't improved within any 5 minutes of practice, I start to go, what am I doing wrong? If it carries on feeling difficult, I have to ask myself, what am I doing wrong here? But what I watch in my students is they just try harder and try harder and try harder, but it's not smart. It's not like, well, how does it feel? What could I do to make it feel easier? This is so important. And when you do that, you will probably 99% of the time just find the right technique. So, most of my life, I've figured out most of the technique myself. And my teachers haven't really needed to teach me technique because good technique is the most effortless way to get an efficient way to get the sound that you want, or the laziest way. And so that was just something I was looking for my whole life, because I never wanted music to be something that was difficult. So I'm like, well, there must be a way of playing this where it feels easy. I don't want to just keep banging my head against the wall with it. Whereas most people just think I'm not working hard enough. And that's just totally not true. So this is, a massive long, deep dive, which was basically saying one of the biggest faults that non-professional amateur pianists have is just moving with their distal joints, where almost everything is moving with the distal joints. So when we feel into the body and feel that we actually really do play the piano with our whole bodies, because there are times when I might want to lean into a note, I might want to it really is with the whole body. And also, because I meditate as well, and actually I had some really interesting experiences with a headband that measures brainwaves. And when I got this headband that measures brainwaves that helps you to meditate, I realized that tiny, and I mean tiny, very, very subtle shifts in the shoulder and the neck. And it could be as subtle as I'm sitting like this and I go, And I do a tiny, tiny let go of one of the joints just at the back of the neck that you probably wouldn't even be able to see. And instantly I'd get the neurofeedback, and I would instantly feel like, now I'm in a more meditative state. It's amazing how the way that our entire body is can affect all these things about our state of mind. And not only the state of mind, but all the nuances of the sound that we get. And if you want to look at it logically, because, if we look at our the biomechanics as a series of levers, the longer the lever is, the more control we have over the note, which is why this is bad. And again, like going back to the beginning, if we're staring, if we're thinking, if we're in our heads and we don't really feel like we have a body, that is the number one reason that I see why people end up just playing with their fingertips. Not very helpful. So, like I said, I could go on and on and on about this. There's so much depth I could go into, but hopefully I've whetted your appetite. I do have room in my studio at the moment for for more students, online teaching as well. So if you're interested in lessons, I am available, and there's lots more tutorials that I have on my YouTube channel. I do quite a lot of tutorials for ABRSM pieces, Trinity pieces. If you'd like to see a tutorial on any aspect of technique or any piece that you'd like to see a tutorial on, please do let me know in the comments below. Do the usual like, subscribe, all that good stuff to help the channel out. And also check the podcast out, like I said. And I hope you enjoyed it. And see you at the next one. Go do some practicing or go watch more of my videos, and take care and goodbye.